Hello and welcome to today's class. My name is Karen Smith and I teach international relations at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Today I'll be speaking briefly about South Africa's position in the international system. As you might know, Africa's role in the international system has long been marginalized, both in theory and in practice. It's often regarded by scholars and practitioners alike as a part of the world that is acted upon rather than having any agency in world affairs. It's therefore important for us to address this shortcoming and look at how the international system is viewed from an African perspective. Of course, South Africa is only one state in a very diverse continent, so my perspective will not necessarily be the same as that of someone from Nigeria or Somalia or Egypt. The important thing, however, is to hear multiple voices from Africa, and not just to hear about Africa from France, the United Kingdom, or the USA. Now, South Africa is sometimes accused in a similar way of claiming to speak for the rest of the continent. Before we get to that, I want to just briefly clarify what I mean by the term the international system. So what we refer to as the international system today is the system of sovereign territorial states that was formalized through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Although in the study of international relations, we assume that the structure of the international system is an anarchical one, the system is also marked by hierarchy. Some states are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, some are nuclear weapon states, some belong to the Group of Seven, and some have more power in the international financial institutions based on their economic power. So while the system is legally based on the sovereign equality of states, we know that in practice a state's position in the system depends on where it finds itself in the global hierarchy of power. So turning now to South Africa, it is often labeled as a regional power. This is due to the fact that while its material, in other words, economic and military power, is of little consequence in global terms, its power relative to other states on the African continent is significant, and it tries to play the role of regional stabilizer through its peacemaking and peacekeeping efforts, which is another characteristic of regional powers. After the end of apartheid and the first democratic election in South Africa in 1994, there were great expectations from the international community about the role that the country would play both in the region and globally. The country's relatively peaceful transition to democracy, together with the international stature of then-President Nelson Mandela, allowed South Africa to exert influence that a state of its kind would not normally be afforded. Of course, the assumption of regional leadership, while supported by the international community at large, was and continues to be contested by other African states and South Africa's neighbors in particular. Over the past 2 decades, South Africa embarked on an ambitious foreign policy, allegedly aimed at reforming the international system. In its foreign policy statements, South Africa has been very vocal about the need for a more just international system that is more representative, is legitimate, and is marked by a more equitable distribution of power. In doing so, it claims to be acting not only in self-interest, but instead to be representing broader African and developing world interests and concerns. The structural constraints posed by the international system, however, mean that a state like South Africa has limited political maneuverability, only being able to challenge the existing system to a limited degree because any deviation may cause exclusion from the international society. So in response, South Africa uses a strategy that some authors have called soft balancing. In other words, it's a mix of both engagement with and subversion of the system. This means that, for example, while South Africa eagerly accepts leadership positions in international organizations, it then uses its positions in those organizations to criticize the system of which those organizations form a part. A case in point is the way in which South Africa has used its membership of the United Nations Security Council. You might know that it was elected as a non-permanent member in 2007, 2008, and 2011, 2012. And so it used its time on the Security Council to criticize the USA and its allies of double standards in their response to conflict and human rights violations. Now, the way in which it does this, by, for example, voting against resolutions condemning human rights violations on procedural grounds, is problematic. But that is a discussion for another day. South Africa also uses its membership of large institutions of the Global South, like the G77 and the Non-Aligned Movement, as well as more exclusive groupings like the BRICS, which of course is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, to push for change in the international system. While South Africa calls for reform of the decision-making powers of global organizations to be more representative, at the same time, it is also a staunch defender of the principles of multilateral international rules, sovereignty, and non-intervention, on which the whole system is built. So its calls for reform are, in fact, largely in response to the way in which global decision-making is dominated by powerful Western states, and also how global rules are inconsistently applied. So the reformed international system that a state like South Africa is proposing is not a radically different one based on new rules and principles, but rather one in which there is greater adherence to and respect for the existing rules on which the system is built. It's therefore a change within the system rather than a large-scale transformation of the system. In calling for greater representation of states from the Global South in global decision-making, in other words, with regard to who makes the rules of the international system, who manages them, and decides when they apply, it can, of course, equally be criticized for simply wanting a seat for itself at the table of global power and using the claim that it represents Africa as a means to get there. Whether South Africa is simply acting in the self-interested way that realists predict, or whether it really wants to improve conditions for all and see a greater sharing of global power, even if that means not sharing in that power itself, is a question I will leave you to think about. Thank you for listening.